The island of Saint Helena sits in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean, 1,200 miles from the nearest coast. In 1815, the British chose it for one reason. There was nowhere further to send a man they needed to disappear. Napoleon Bonaparte arrived there in October of that year, 45 years old, already aged beyond his years by 2 decades of continuous warfare. He would spend the next 6 years in a damp estate called Longwood House, complaining of stomach pain, nausea, and a fatigue that never lifted. The walls ran with condensation. The rooms were rarely warm. He died on May 5, 1821. The official verdict, delivered by a British military doctor at autopsy, was stomach cancer. That explanation stood unchallenged for more than a century. Then a French toxicologist named Pascal Kintz ran the numbers on a lock of Napoleon's hair, and the story fell apart. Hair is not just dead material, it is a chemical archive. As each strand grows, it absorbs trace elements from the bloodstream, heavy metals, toxins, whatever was circulating in the body at the time. A single strand can be divided into segments that map exposure month by month, year by year, like rings inside a tree, recording every drought and every flood. When Kintz analyzed Napoleon's hair in 2001, he was not searching for anything in particular. He found something anyway. The arsenic concentration in the sample was 38 times the normal threshold. Not slightly elevated, not a borderline result. 38 times. That number was hard to explain and impossible to ignore. The finding landed like an accusation. Headlines declared Napoleon had been murdered. The suspect was obvious. His British captors controlled everything on Saint Helena: his food, his water, his access to the outside world. A deliberate slow poisoning, invisible and deniable, fit the narrative too neatly. Within weeks, the theory had spread across 3 continents. Within months, it had generated a book, a documentary, and a formal criminal allegation aimed at a dead empire. Some researchers pointed to large doses of calomel, a mercury-based compound routinely used as medicine at the time. Others noted that wine and tobacco of the era already carried trace arsenic as a matter of course. The murder accusation was clean, satisfying, and, as it turned out, incomplete. The science was not finished, and it was not saying what the headlines assumed. When researchers obtained authenticated hair samples from different periods of Napoleon's life, not just the final months on Saint Helena, but strands dated to 1805 to 1814 from earlier in his military campaigns, the arsenic was already there. The levels were lower, but the pattern was unmistakable. Whatever had been deposited in his tissue was not the work of a single poisoner at a single moment. It was a signature that followed him across decades, chronic, systematic, and invisible to anyone alive at the time. To confirm those samples were genuinely his, forensic geneticists applied short tandem repeat profiling to the follicle cells still attached to several of the strands. The genetic signatures matched across samples held in different collections on different continents. The hair was his, and the arsenic in it was not a late introduction. It was woven into his physiology long before he ever set foot on Saint Helena. The most credible explanation was hiding in the wallpaper. Longwood House was decorated with a fashionable green pigment called Scheele's green, made from copper arsenite. It was one of the most popular decorative colors in early 19th century Europe and one of the most toxic compounds anyone had ever introduced into a domestic interior without understanding what they were doing. In the persistent damp of St. Helena's climate, certain molds growing on the walls metabolized the copper arsenite and released arsine gas into the air of the rooms. Napoleon slept in those rooms for 6 years. He breathed the compound nightly, while his body slowly accumulated what the walls were releasing. This was not murder by design. It was an accidental chemistry that no one at the time had the tools to detect or the framework to imagine. The arsenic found in the final phase of his life was real, but it was chronic environmental accumulation, not a targeted campaign. The murder theory was built on a real number, interpreted without the full context. The headline was not false. The conclusion drawn from it was. Still, the arsenic alone could not explain what killed him. In 2021, a team of researchers working with the Napoleon Museum used advanced spectroscopic imaging on preserved gastric tissue from the original 1821 autopsy. What they found was both expected and clarifying. The stomach showed pathology consistent with a perforated ulcer and advanced gastric lesions. Stomach cancer was not a fabrication by a British Army doctor covering up a murder. It was the final mechanism. The arsenic had not caused it, but 6 years of chronic exposure, prolonged illness, and the grinding conditions of captivity had not helped a body that was already fighting to survive. Then the DNA said something no one had asked it to say. When researchers examined Napoleon's paternal lineage through Y chromosome analysis, they found haplogroup E1b1b1. This lineage does not cluster with the French or Western European populations Napoleon is culturally identified with. It traces back to the Mediterranean rim, to populations in North Africa and the ancient Levant. It is the same haplogroup found in significant frequencies among Berber communities in Morocco and Algeria, and among populations in the southern Italian peninsula and the islands. Napoleon was Corsican by birth, and his paternal genetic signature reflected exactly that. His family carried a lineage that predated the concept of France as a nation by thousands of years. Lines running back through a Mediterranean world that had no political borders on any European map. There is an irony in that finding that takes a moment to absorb. The man who reorganized European civilization, who placed his brothers on the thrones of Spain, Naples, and the Netherlands, who made national identity the most powerful political force of his century, carried a paternal lineage that placed him genetically closer to North Africa than to Paris. The ideology of European power he rode to dominance was precisely the mythology his own DNA quietly eroded. There was more. A genetic variant identified in his genome is associated with pituitary dysfunction, a disruption of the hormonal signaling system that regulates metabolism, growth, and sexual development. It aligns with the documented physical changes of his later years, the striking weight gain that began in his 30s, the fatigue, the loss of the relentless forward momentum his marshals had come to depend on. Contemporaries noticed the change and attributed it to comfort and political distraction. The genetic record suggests a different explanation. His body was failing by mechanisms that no physician of the era could have named, measured, or treated. The man who defined himself through will, through motion and conquest, and the absolute refusal of limits, was being undone by processes his century had no language for. A compromised endocrine system, arsenic absorbed from a pigment in a decorative pattern, a stomach dissolving from within. He spent his final months dictating his memoirs, constructing the legend that would outlast everything. He almost certainly did not know what was actually happening inside his cells. The British doctor who signed the death certificate was not wrong. Stomach cancer was the proximate cause. But the full answer is stranger and more layered than any single verdict could hold. It is a story of chronic poisoning without deliberate intent, of genetic origins that contradict the identity the legend claimed, of a body collapsing under conditions that would not be understood for another 100 years. What Napoleon's DNA revealed about his death is not a murder mystery confirmed. It is a simpler and more unsettling truth. The most dangerous man of the 19th century was undone not by British scheming, but by wallpaper, by biology, and by a paternal bloodline that had nothing to do with France at all. If you want more stories where DNA turns the official record inside out, subscribe. The next one will surprise you.